We have an agreement, as of last night, on top-line numbers for this budget. We have days to implement those top-line numbers.
Democratic Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and GOP House Speaker Mike Johnson said they've got a deal, and they say it's going to avoid a government shutdown later this month. But the conservative House Freedom Caucus isn't buying it. The deal would keep the government funded for the rest of the fiscal year at $1.59 trillion, count 'em, trillion dollars. The breakdown: $886 billion for defense, $704 billion for non-defense. Schumer called it a win for Democrats. The Freedom called it a total failure. And now there's a growing number of hardline conservatives who want to lump border security to the broader government funding bill. That's going to complicate things. Lawmakers return to Congress from their holiday recess this week, and they've got until January 19th to get to some type of a deal, or else there's going to be a partial government shutdown. Time now for the Decision Desk 2024 with just 1 week to go. Can you believe it? Until the Republican Iowa caucus. Former President Donald Trump barnstormed through the Hawkeye state with 4 rallies in 2 days over the weekend. And polls have him leading big amongst Republicans, even as Nikki Haley is running neck and neck with Ron DeSantis, who is banking it all on Iowa. And this week, DeSantis and Haley will square off in a CNN debate in Iowa that none of the other candidates qualified for, except Trump. Trump has refused to debate his GOP rivals, instead opting for a Fox News town hall. And then there's this. Call it a tale of two political realities. On the anniversary of the January 6th Capitol riot, Biden and Trump offered 2 very different views of the day that divided America.
Political violence is never, ever acceptable in the United States political system. Never, never, never. It has no place in a democracy, none. You can't be pro-insurrectionist and pro-American.
It's when you talk about insurrection, what they're doing, that's the real deal. That's the real deal, not patriotically and peacefully. Peacefully and patriotically.
National average of the polls have Trump leading Biden, but joining me now to discuss the latest from the Decision Desk is no stranger to Trump world and all that it entails. Anthony Scaramucci, former Trump White House communications director turned sharp Trump critic. He also founded Skybridge Capital up there on the street. Mooch, thanks for being here. What is Wall Street even interpreting 2024 on the political front? Because it seems like there's this sense of unpredictability in the political landscape.
Oh, listen, it's painful for me to admit this, but Wall Street is basically nonchalant to this election. I think they viewed Donald Trump by and large as benign to somewhat beneficial to the economy and business, despite the fact that he spent $7.8 trillion of additional deficit spending. And I think that they're viewing this as a Fed-driven market more than it is a Democratic or Republican presidency market. So that's unfortunate because, as President Biden is pointing out, Mr. Trump is a great risk to the institutions of America. And, you know, I think if we lose any of those cherished institutions, it's ultimately really bad for business. So it's a great irony that people aren't focused enough on what's at stake here.
Anthony, if Donald Trump ends up being the standard bearer for the Republican Party, and all the polls suggest that that's what's going to happen, do you think that there will be a viable third choice or an alternative choice that's a viable candidacy to challenge the status quo of a Trump-Biden rematch?
No is the short answer, and I'll just be brief in explaining why. In 1992, Ross Perot, a jug-eared billionaire, got 19.9% of the vote. And that scared the daylights out of the two parties. And so they tightened their duopoly on the system, and they've made it barely impossible for a third-party candidate to emerge. There's too much regulation, too many different hoops that these people have to jump through. And, of course, they don't have the mechanisms or the operations of the big party movements. So, look, America's dissatisfied with these parties. 40+% of the Americans registered to vote are now independent. So that's the top draw. It's then followed by the Democrats, and the Republicans obviously have the smallest number of registrations. But I just don't see anybody being able to break that duopoly right now. Maybe a few years from now, but not right now.
You're headed to Davos for the World Economic Forum, and one of the big cryptocurrency stories here in Washington, D.C., anticipated in the next day or two is whether or not crypto will be allowed in the ETF market. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, anticipated to make their decision. You've garnered a lot of attention on Twitter. You say it's a done deal. Why do you say that?
Well, they lost the court case. And so ultimately, Gary Gensler, despite being an acolyte of Elizabeth Warren, who I think Elizabeth Warren wasn't actually Pocahontas, but she's probably like George Washington's grandfather. She's this ancient relic from a past, doesn't understand crypto. And despite her so-called progressive status, and supposedly is for the unbanked, she doesn't like crypto, even though things like Bitcoin benefit those people. Those two people don't like crypto, but they lost the big court case. And so it's going to force the hand of the SEC to allow for this cash ETF to take place. I predict the trading announcement will be on the 10th of January. That's when the deadline is. Of course, if they, for some reason, rug pull the industry, there'll be 25 or 30 lawsuits. And I don't think the DC Circuit is going to think kindly of that situation with the SEC, because they already lost that case, and then they made a decision not to appeal it to the Supreme Court. So I think it happens. I think it'll be a great day for the financial services community and financial services tech in general. And of course, Skybridge, we obviously own a lot of Bitcoin, full disclosure. We own things like Solana, and I have a very large position in these digital assets in our fund. And, we made these investments 3 years ago. So we were a little ahead of the curve there, and we took on heavy criticism for that, particularly in the 2022 bear market.
Well, specifically with FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried, and there was all of this lack of trust in the industry. So how might this be a turning point in restoring trust back to the market, especially once you get ETFs involved, which will, as you know better than anyone, really expand the marketplace for these types of financial products?
Yes, I think there's a watershed moment for Bitcoin in particular, because if you've got the authorization to have a cash ETF, and companies like BlackRock and Fidelity, some of the largest asset managers in the world, are going in that direction, then it makes it acceptable to expand your portfolio into things like Bitcoin. So even a 1% allocation to something like Bitcoin across institutions and individuals, high net worth individuals, et cetera, would be a big boon for Bitcoin and the price of Bitcoin. You mentioned the FTX situation and the lack of trust in the system. Unfortunately, when you have these new technologies that are advancing, you do get some levels of charlatanism. We saw that with the railroads. We saw that in telecom. You pick the industry. It is rife, unfortunately, with bad actors. But I think this is a step in the right direction, because some of the largest, most regulated players on Wall Street will be involved with this. So I think it'll make it safer for the general public.
Anthony, you started this interview by talking about the Federal Reserve and Fed Chairman Jay Powell and what he is going to do with rates, which the market is anticipating at the end of this quarter or into the second quarter in terms of a reduction in the rates. But there's a lot of talk about the Federal Reserve and a digital currency. What's the update on the U.S. dollar and the digital currency that the Fed is looking into?
So listen, it's interesting. The Fed, they wrote a white paper in July of 2017. I remember that because I was in the White House when it happened, and since I was only there for 11 days, I have very vivid memories of that. And so I think I was presented that paper on a Wednesday, and the reason I know that, Kev, is I was only there for one Wednesday, so I sort of know that it was a Wednesday. But it's 6-7 years later. Nothing has happened, and I predict nothing is going to happen. There are still libertarian impulses inside the Fed and in and around the American government, and I don't think they like the idea of bringing out a digital dollar that's sponsored by the Fed. I think a safer route, at least for now, will be using things like Circle or things like Tether, which are stable coins that are denominated in U.S. dollars that are on the blockchain. I think it's going to stay there for now. There's just too many people in Washington that don't understand it, and a result of which I think it's going to slow down the adoption process.
Last question for you, Anthony Scaramucci. You've got a vintage comic book framed in the shot behind you. I'm a big comic book guy, so I got to ask you, what's the story behind that?
Okay, so if you look closely, that's actually my wife and I sitting next to Batman and Terry Savalas from Kojak. Sonny Bono is actually talking to me. And that is actually a iteration of a 1976 comic. It was Superman versus Muhammad Ali, but if you can read it closely, it says Superboy versus Muhammad Ali. I made it Superboy because the person that did that for me is Mike Grell. He's the legendary 70s comic artist that did all of the Superboy comics when I was a kid growing up. And so if you look really closely, and I'll send you a picture of it, Kevin, Jack Kennedy is in the audience, but so is Marilyn Monroe, one of his mistresses, and so is Jackie Kennedy. Lucille Ball, Ronald Reagan, Johnny Carson, Frank Sinatra, the Rat Pack is in the in the crowd there.
Sinatra's my guy. You know,
yeah, Sinatra's everybody's guy, you know.
Nah, he's Delco's guy. Anthony Scaramucci, Skyridge Capital. Send me that pic. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on. Have fun in Davos.
You got it. You got it, brother. Thank you. Happy New Year.
You too. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is traveling in the Middle East in hopes of preventing the Israel-Hamas war from spreading.
This is a conflict that could easily metastasize from day one. Among other priorities, we have been intensely focused on working to prevent the conflict from spreading.
Blinken's latest visit marks his fourth since the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack against Israel. To date, the death toll in Gaza has climbed to nearly 23,000. 22,835 lives lost, to be exact. And according to Reuters, an Israeli strike hit South Lebanon Monday, killing a senior commander of Hezbollah. It is one of the highest profile attacks on its leadership since the start of the Israel-Hamas war. Hundreds of Alaska Airlines and United flights operating on Boeing 737 MAX jets are still being grounded after a door from one of the aircrafts blew open midair.
Seattle, Alaska, 1282, we just depressurized, we're declaring emergency, we need to descend down to 10,000. We just depressurized and we need to return back to Portland.
Minutes after an Alaska Airlines flight took off from Portland, Oregon, a plug holding one of the jet's doors blew off, and that meant the door, headrest, seat, and seat cushions were all sucked out of the window. Fortunately, everybody on board made it back to Portland International Airport safely. But one thing that also was sucked out of the window, at least one Apple iPhone. It fell 16,000 feet from the plane to the ground, and it was still working. Somebody found it in airplane mode with a half a battery left and alerted the authorities. National Transportation Safety Board Chair Jennifer Homendy said that the flights in the U.S. are still safe.
Those watching may be curious about safety or concerned about safety. We have the safest aviation system in the world.
Airline officials said that cancellations could last a few more days, but that they're working with the affected travelers. NASA's first lunar landing moon mission in 50 years is at risk because of an engine problem preventing the spacecraft from pointing towards the sun for power.
We have ignition and liftoff of the first United Launch Alliance Vulcan rocket.
It's unknown right now whether the issue will jeopardize the entire mission, but regardless, it's not just a small step, but a giant leap for mankind's privatization of the space industry, specifically with the moon. Here's why. NASA launched technology and robotics from the private companies on board the rocket so that the private space companies can gather information about the moon. The thinking is that the privatization of space will help private companies make deliveries for NASA and other customers here on Earth. And that's it for today's Daily Debrief. My name is Kevin Cirilli. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.